Hello, everyone. This is Brad Tallis from Autodesk. Wanted to welcome you to today's Fusion 360 Direct Modeling webinar. This is myself talking. I'm a Fusion Success team member. I've been with Autodesk about 3 years, over 23 years in the industry. And my specialty is actually in direct modeling. That's my background. So you got the right person for today's topic. One of the things I love about Fusion, as-built joints, T-splines, the built-in cam, pretty much everything. The fact that it has direct modeling and parametric modeling, etc. I mentioned I'm part of the Fusion Success team. We're a group committed to making customers more productive with Fusion 360, and we have experts on our team to help quickly close the knowledge gap. Such as I've got industrial designers, I've got CAM specialists, direct modeling specialists, etc. And so these webinars are one of those ways on how we can help close the knowledge gap while you're starting with Fusion 360. So by the end of today's session, we should have a basic understanding of how to edit geometry using direct modeling techniques. And then I'm going to show you how to fix, for example, corrupt models using, for example, the wound and heal method, which is what I call the wound and heal method. You'll see some tips and tricks with working with corrupt models, and then using direct modeling techniques to quickly mock up a design. We do have upcoming webinars. So, and by the way, this session is being recorded. So you'll get a follow-up email with a link to that recording. And I'll also include a link to this Sway document that I'm using. That way you have access to these live links. So for example, if I click here, it'll take us to the events page. And you can see, for example, right now we're in the direct modeling deep dive. There's an assemblies webinar tomorrow. If I scroll down, you'll see generative design, sheet metal, rendering, etc. So definitely recommend signing up for those if you haven't already. But we do know that you can't always attend the webinars at the particular date and time that we offer them. So we do have them recorded. So if you want to look at some of the other topics such as assemblies, sculpting, CAM fundamentals, etc., you can take a look at this link here. Like I mentioned, this session is being recorded. So keep an eye out for a follow-up email with a link to that recording. Also, as we're going through, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them out into the Q&A section of Zoom webinar, and I'll either try and answer them live or at the end, depending on the question. So let's dive right in. Today's topic is all about direct modeling, and what going back and giving you some history. Back in the day, you basically had to pick what kind of CAD program you wanted to use, whether it was parametric or direct. So, for example, I actually came from Hewlett Packard. We wrote our own direct modeler. It was back in the day. It was called Solid Designer. There was no parametrics really in it. You worked directly on the model, and what that means is, if I wanted to, for example, move this feature, I would just say move that feature 10 millimeters. I didn't go into a sketch and change a dimension or anything like that. More recently, a lot of the CAD companies have realized that parametric modeling is powerful, but so is direct modeling, and they've actually kind of started merging the two technologies. And I think Fusion does one of the best jobs with that. So I'm going to show you some of those tips and tricks with this session today. So for example, here is a part, and you'll notice that I have a timeline, but I have nothing in there. There's no sketches, there's no features, nothing. So this might have come from like a step file or an IGES file. Maybe we got it off of a web page somewhere. We got it from a customer, but there's absolutely no history. So I need to change some of the things on this model to make it a little bit better. And we can use direct editing to do that. So here's a prime example. We can see all these ribs along the edge here, but there's this really kind of a small rib right here, and it just doesn't make sense to have that small rib. So I want to get rid of it. And I've seen I've probably been to 1,000 customers at least in my day. Um, I actually came from the federal aerospace and defense arena, so been to a lot of customers. And what I would actually see them do in other CAD systems, if they wanted to get rid of this, the time or their history tree was so complex, it took a long time to figure out where was this rib created and how was it created, etc. So they literally would just draw a sketch and machine away. And it would basically just extrude this away. And that's what I call the hack and whack method. And sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. For example, if this face was slightly tapered, like let's just say 1 or 2 degrees, that would then you'd machine this away, but then there'd be an indentation and all this kind of stuff. It gets pretty complicated. So we're going to let Fusion do the hard work. In fact, I'm just going to select these 3 faces like so. Okay. Now, if I look closely, you're going to see a slight issue here. This face is not in the same plane as this face. And when you're doing direct editing, you kind of have to think, how is the software going to solve this? So if I hit delete right now, it would probably fail. Okay. Does this face grow to the left? And if so, how far? Does it grow to this edge over here? And if it does, that this face is angled, so that could get kind of complicated. Or does it take this face and grow it to the right, but then it's going to go behind this other face? So if I were to hit delete right now, it would actually fail. So I'm going to add in one more face. I'm going to add in this face right here. Now you can kind of see what's going to happen. Fusion has to heal this area. So if it's going to remove all of these blue faces, it's going to have to grow this face. So it's going to grow along here to the next boundary, which actually happens to be this face here. In fact, let me show you what I mean. I'm just going to right mouse click and say delete. And you can see exactly what happened. It took that face and it grew it to the next boundary, which actually happened to be this face. So let's undo and redo. You can kind of see how that worked. Okay. So in this example, I did have to add that extra face in there to make that work. So let's do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to select that face. I'm going to hold down my control key to select that face. And I don't know if you noticed the little tip that I did, but if I click and hold for about a second, you can actually kind of probe through your part. So you can see it's almost like shooting a laser through your part. So there's the first face, then there's the second face, and it's just going to keep going through, grabbing all of the different faces that laser would hit. So instead of having to rotate around, I can just click and hold and grab that other face. So let me do that again. Click, click, click and hold for about a second. And I can grab that face and grab that face. Instead of having to rotate around and grabbing this other face, you can just kind of probe through. So I could right mouse click and say delete at about the 10 o'clock, or I could just hit the delete key on my keyboard. So I just hit delete on my keyboard and you can see that those faces went away. I didn't have to draw a sketch. I didn't have to machine anything or add extra stuff to my timeline. Okay. Now here's another example. I see this nice sloped face right here, but there's an edge right here that doesn't really make sense. And it kind of looks like they're not at a flat angle. In fact, let me inspect that. I'm just going to click on this face and this face. And sure enough, it's almost 180 degrees, but not quite. And maybe I don't want to see this little line right here when we create our plastic part. So I'll just click on that face and hit the delete key. And notice Fusion had to heal, so it had to grow this face. We undo. So you can kind of see how we just kind of fix that little area right there, changing the angle slightly to make that one solid face. Let's do the same thing here. I'll say delete, and we can see that now we have nice, smooth surfaces there. Okay. Um, let's keep going on here. So here's another example, and I've seen this a lot where you can see there's like this cutout right here, and the fillets just kind of end, and there's no fillet on the end or whatever. It almost seems like this might have been a mistake, like something machined this away, and the engineer didn't notice it until it's way too late. And this shelf is supposed to be at the same height as this shelf up here. And these fillets are supposed to go all the way along the edges and etc. Okay. So how would you fix this? Well, like I said, I've seen people create a sketch and they extrude that all the way over to here, but then that would cover up the slot area. So then they'd create another sketch that kind of, traced over the slot, and they'd extrude that through. Well, not with Fusion. I'm going to just select these two faces. And again, think about what Fusion is going to have to do. If I delete these two faces, it's going to have to grow to the next boundary, which is way over here. It's going to have to grow this to the next boundary, which is this face right here. So if I say delete, instantly you can see how it fixed the model. And it even extended this fillet. You'll notice there's not a line or whatever. It's not patched together. It's actually a fillet on both sides. Okay. And it extended up our slot. Again, let me undo. You can kind of see what's going on here. Okay. No sketches, no nothing. Pretty powerful. Now I've been deleting kind of like single faces and stuff like that. What if I wanted to delete this whole slot? Well, I could come in, right mouse click and say delete. And I'm going to kind of look at it from the top and just draw a box around it like so. So I selected all of those faces at the same time. Okay. I'll go ahead and say okay. And sure enough, it got rid of that slot. Now let's do that again. I'm going to come in here and say delete. I'll draw a box around it. Now here's something really interesting. Notice this says, 5 entities. So it selected all 5 of those faces. Now I could have done them manually. I could have come in here and selected them, but that takes a lot longer. Okay. Now, the reason I kind of looked at it from the top is if I just went like this and drew a box around it, like so, I might get faces that I don't want. In fact, you'll notice it kind of grabbed a face way back here. Okay. So you need to be a little bit careful when you're drawing your selection box because you're going to get stuff that you might not want to get rid of. Okay. So that's why you'll see me sometimes kind of look at it sort of from the top, sort of close. I'll go like so. I'll rotate around, kind of make sure I don't see any extra blue faces that I didn't mean to select. And then I can say okay. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them or even comments. Post them out into the Q&A, and I'll try and answer them live or at the end for you. So hopefully you're finding this useful and kind of seeing the power of what you can do with this. So let's kind of take a look at this little screw boss right here. Let's say that this part that it connects to, there was a change made to the other part, and this screw boss is no longer in the correct orientation. So we need to change that. So we've been deleting faces. Now we're going to actually physically change. We're going to move. So I'm going to right mouse click and say move. Okay. Or you could grab it from this icon up here. So I'm going to say move. Now the important thing is right here. I don't want to move the whole component or the whole body. I want to move individual faces. So we need to make sure that we're set to faces. Then I'm just going to draw a box around what I want to move. So I'm going to draw a box around this screw boss thing. You can see it highlighted all of those faces blue. And now if I drag up or down, we can see how we're physically changing the location of this screw boss. Pretty impressive, I think. Again, not changing a sketch or a dimension or anything like that. Okay. So Simon asked a really good question. How do you unselect single items from a group? So for example, I drew a box around all of these. I could come in and let me go ahead and just do this really quick. I'll draw a box. I'm gonna go move like so. Oops, sorry. Make sure it says faces. Draw a box. And then I could come in, and if I hold down my shift key, I can unselect or reselect regions. And you're actually going to see this a lot more in some of the other stuff that I'm doing, where we're actually going to select a whole bunch of stuff and then remove a couple things out of it. So yeah, great question. Thanks for asking that, Simon. Okay, now here's another tip that I'm going to share with you. When I come in here and I say move and make sure I'm set to faces, and I draw a box around this guy, by default, it's set to free move. So if I drag this down, let's just say -3 mm, and I say, okay, I've moved that down 3 mm. And you'll notice that it's actually capturing all of the steps that we're doing in our timeline. So I can come back and say, for example, put that slot back in there. I've just suppressed that delete. Okay. So it's kind of cool that it's actually remembering what you're doing. But here's the thing. If I edit my move face, you'll notice it doesn't say that it moved exactly 3 mm. And that's because it was called a free move. It's not capturing any of that information. Okay. So what I recommend doing, I'm going to undo back. Okay. What I recommend doing is when you say move and we draw our box around, you want to be more specific. So here, instead of saying free move, we can say translate. Okay. And Julian asked a question, could you move, instead of a distance, could you move like between points? And the answer is yes. And you're going to see that again. Here's point to point. So you'll see that coming up in just a moment. But we have free move, we've got translate, we've got rotate, and point and point to position. So in this case, I'm going to say translate, and you'll notice my icons here got a little bit simpler. You don't see all the rotates and the scales and the planes and all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to go ahead and drag this down. We'll say -3 mm. I'll say okay. Now if I edit my feature, you can see that it actually did capture that distance. So I could come back and say it wasn't supposed to be 3, it was supposed to be 2. You can see how that moved slightly, or let's just say 1 in this case. So I recommend using translate and rotate instead of using free move. Okay. Let's take this to the next level. We've moved it down 1 mm, but it's also at the wrong angle. So I'm going to say move. And this time, instead of drawing a box from left to right, which is what's called a window selection, it's only going to select the faces that are inside the window. I'm going to drag from right to left, and you'll notice that the window looks slightly different. This is what we call a crossing window. So it's going to select anything that's inside the window and any faces that the window crosses. So you'll notice it's now selected a lot more of this arm. Okay. I'm also going to say rotate. And let's just go ahead and click on either a round face or a round edge. It doesn't really matter. This is my favorite part. Check this out. I can grab, let me move over just a little bit, grab this guy and start to rotate, and you'll see a live preview of what that's going to look like. So it's actually rotating those faces around, around this edge. Okay. Now you'll notice a warning that appears down in the corner. It says additional faces have been moved. Okay. What that's basically saying is, notice that it's actually keeping the tangency, and of course my number's right over it. It's keeping that tangency condition of this round face or whatever. So it's actually changing the size of that face. All of these faces are staying the same size, etc. but it's changing that one down there. And I can be very specific. I could say, okay, let's rotate exactly 25 degrees. Say okay, and we've rotated that screw boss 25 degrees. Okay. Here's another example. As I'm looking at these ribs right here, they kind of terminate way over here. And to me, it would make more sense for strength reasons if they kind of terminated where this screw boss is at. So I want to kind of change the angle of these ribs. Like, let me kind of rotate a little bit. However, you'll notice there's quite a few faces that involve this rib. I mean, there's little fillets and blends and all kind of stuff on the inside, etc. And if I were to have to hack and whack this away, I'd have to machine down to here. I'd probably have to recreate this circular feature and all that kind of stuff. It would probably get kind of difficult. Okay. Well, let's use direct modeling. So I'm going to come in here and say move, making sure I'm set to faces. I'm going to grab this front face, and then I'm going to click and hold to grab the back face. And believe it or not, that's all I have to select. I don't need to select this top face because basically we're saying we want to rotate these two vertical faces. So anything that touches it has to update also. So that top face is going to update automatically. Okay. Let's do a rotate. I'll go ahead and rotate maybe like around this edge or face, doesn't really matter. I'm going to grab this guy and start to move, and we get a live preview of what that's going to look like. And again, you can see, even though I only selected those two faces, it's actually moving the top face of that rib also. And here is what blows me away, is how smart Fusion is. Notice this edge terminates on this top face right here. But as I rotate to the left, you'll see that it actually extends that blend all the way down to the next boundary. So it's pretty smart. In other systems, as soon as that edge dropped off that other face, it would fail. It wouldn't know what to do. So let's kind of take a look at this, and I can see around, it looks like that's 5.4. So it looks like around 5 to 6 degrees or whatever. So let's just do maybe 5 in this case. Yeah, that looks really good. I'll say okay. And I just rotated that rib to be more in line with that screw boss. Let's do that again. I'll select the front face. I'll select the back face. I'll say rotate. Last time I did it on this edge. This time let's just do it on this face. Really doesn't matter. Start to rotate so we can kind of see what that looks like. And we did 5 degrees on the last one. So let's do 5 degrees on this one. And now if we take a look at this, we've just updated this plastic injection molded part to rotate those ribs a little bit. Hopefully you find that as cool as I think it is. Again, not having to worry about sketches or anything like that. And what this basically means is you can work with pretty much anybody's data, whether it came from SolidWorks or Pro-E or McMaster-Carr or GrabCAD or SketchUp or whatever. You can bring those models in and work with them just like you created them. Okay. Here's another example, and I see this one a lot. So notice this curve right here is nice and smooth, transitions to this curve nice and smooth, transitions to this curve nice and smooth. But right here, and let me just kind of unselect, there's kind of a sharp transition. It's not tangential right here for whatever reason. It's kind of a sharp transition where here it's nice and smooth. And again, maybe the engineer, the designer, whatever, made a mistake or something, who knows? And unfortunately, there's no feature to go back to fix this. So how do we resolve it? Well, let's just delete the problematic face. Now, before I do that, think about what's going to have to happen here. This face is going to grow to the next boundary, which is this one here. So watch what happens when I delete this face. It actually comes to a sharp point. It grew as far as it could, and then this one grew as far as it could, and now we have a sharp point. Well, all I have to do now is recreate that fillet. So I'm going to select on it and say fillet. And here's another neat little trick. What size? All I have to do is click on an existing fillet and it grabs the information. So in this case, it's 20. Hopefully, if you didn't know that, you learned something new today. I'll say okay, and now we can see, let's take a look at it again. We have a really nice transition one more time. It's nice and tangential. Just by deleting that problematic face out of there and recreating the fillet. Okay. And then finally, on this part, maybe we've done an FEA analysis or we've 3D printed this and done some testing or something like that. And we determined that this plastic front piece is just a little bit too fragile to only be supported by one rib. And instead, maybe we want to have two ribs instead of just the one. Again, you could just machine this away, create a sketch, maybe project it, machine it away or whatever. Or we could use direct editing. So we're going to say move, making sure we're on faces, and I'm going to select, again, only the two faces that I'm really concerned about are these two. I don't even have to select these little fillets because they're touching these other faces. So if these big rectangle faces move, those should move with it. We'll select rotate. Maybe I'll just rotate around this outside edge. Start to move, and you can see that it's actually moving that whole fillet, that whole feature, that rib feature, including the fillets. So let's go maybe, let's just say 35 degrees. And I've just moved that rib, and it actually updated the fillets to keep them tangential and all that kind of stuff. You can kind of see that. Okay. Now, I want to move this to the other side also. So we're just going to use the mirror command. Now, it's asking for bodies. Well, no, I want to mirror faces. And this time, I am going to select all of those faces. I'm going to kind of draw a window selection box like so. I'm going to select all of those because I want to say mirror all of these faces. Okay. What's my mirror plane? It's the plane that kind of cuts through the middle. And it gives me just a basic kind of a preview. I'll say okay. And we now have our two ribs that are supporting this plastic piece. Okay. Now, Julian asked a good question. Will Fusion give me errors if I select too many faces? And the answer is it depends. And as we go through, I'm actually going to get harder and harder. We're going to start fixing some more complex parts and stuff like that. And you're going to learn some tips and tricks on how to, what faces do we select? How many do we select? What if I don't select enough? And I'll be honest, probably the hardest thing with direct editing is figuring out what is the software going to do? What's it expecting and stuff like that? Okay, so I'm going to answer that question as we go through. But hopefully you saw in this part, we made multiple changes to this part. Okay, we got rid of some tiny ribs we didn't need. We smoothed out this face to have it come out of the mold a little bit easier, not have a line that cuts across it. We changed the orientation of these ribs. We got rid of a feature in the back and got rid of that mistake in the back. We moved this screw boss up and down and also rotated it. And then we finally moved an existing rib and just mirrored it instead of having to recreate it. So we actually did quite a bit on this part with no history, nothing. Okay. So here's another, this is actually a real world example. So I made my own CNC machine out in the garage, and I obviously modeled the whole thing and bought some of these pillow blocks or whatever. And the ones that I got, don't look exactly like this. And the manufacturer that I got them from didn't have a 3D model of their pillow block. But I found this one out on GrabCAD. In fact, I think if I just go out here real quick, GrabCAD, let me see. Bummer. Um, I usually have it. Uh, so here it is. Oh, well, it should be. Sorry. RHP30. Yeah, usually it finds it. Oh well, I'm not going to waste your guys' time. Anyways, I got that out on GrabCAD, and it was a SolidWorks model. So, it was created in a totally different CAD tool, but I was able to upload it into my design. But I wanted to make it look pretty much exactly the same as the one that I had purchased. So the one that I have didn't have this logo on the top. So let's just draw a box around that logo. Okay. You can see it selected all of those faces, and there's a lot of them in here. There's lots of little tiny faces and stuff like that. And we'll just hit the delete key on our keyboard, and instantly that goes away. Also, the grease zerk was on the very top of mine. So I'm going to come in here and say move faces. I'll just draw a box around that grease zerk. And this is the one thing I really love. If I hit rotate, it actually recognizes edges and circular faces and stuff like that on an imported model. So I could say rotate around this axis. I'll start to drag, and it looks like around 35 degrees. So I'm going to say 35, enter, and now the grease zerk is on the top. Also, mine didn't have this curved face right here. So I'm going to select those 4 faces. And again, think about what Fusion is going to have to do. When it heals this, it's going to grow this face all the way across. So when I say delete, sure enough, it went all the way across. Okay. Do the same thing here. I'll select those faces, hit delete, and we now have the exact representation of the model that I purchased from a company. Okay. Now, there's pros and cons with parametric modeling and with direct modeling. One of the cons with direct modeling is, for example, this blend that goes all the way around this model. I want to make it a little bit smaller, but you'll notice I don't have a history tree. I don't have any features to come in and edit and say, make that smaller. So I'd actually have to physically select all of these faces and hope that I don't make a mistake and accidentally click something wrong or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. That would take some time. There's potential for error, okay? So that's one of the drawbacks with direct modeling is I don't have a feature to go back to. However, we have a really cool thing in here under the Create menu called Find Features. You'll only see this if you are not capturing your design history. So you'll notice I do not have a timeline along the bottom. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I right click on this top level, you can see right here, it says Capture Design History. If I click on that, I now have a timeline, and anything I do, like chamfers or extrudes or deletes or whatever, will show up in my timeline. But notice Find Features does not show up down here anymore. If I right mouse click on this again and say, do not capture design history, I'll get a message saying, hey, it's going to remove anything you have in your timeline and further operations will not be captured. I'll say, okay. My timeline goes away, but now I can come in here and say, find features. And what this does is it allows us to look for all of it, all of the stuff, such as fillets, holes, chamfers, extrusions, mirrors, patterns, etc. Or I could come in here and say, just search for fillets, for example. Okay, but for fun, we'll select everything. I'll draw a box around the whole thing and say, okay. And literally in about 2 or 3 seconds, it scans the model and it figures out what it could from this imported model from SolidWorks. There's a chamfer. Sure enough, if we look at the bottom, it kind of looks like a chamfer. It said these guys are kind of the revolves. Maybe they were created with some like revolve shapes. It figured out these slots are mirrors of each other. A bunch of different fillets. Okay, there's the corner fillets. And as I keep going through, I can see, look, at fillet 19 actually goes all the way around the model. And if I double click on it, I can now edit this. It says it's a radius of 2. We want it to be a radius of 1. We say okay, and we've just updated that fillet on this model. So I did not have to delete them individually and recreate them. All I did was scan the find features, and it found all of these different fillets. So for example, here's these end fillets. It says it's radius of 8. Let's make those a radius of 10. And I just made those corners bigger, and it's a radius of 10. I think that's pretty cool. Okay. So again, you can pretty much work with anybody's data, bring it in, make the slight changes that you need. And maybe if you need to go a little bit deeper, you could scan for those features and edit those features. Okay. I noticed a bunch more people have signed in. If you guys came in a little bit late, this session is being recorded. So you'll get a follow-up email with a link to that recording a couple hours after the session. So I usually get asked, is the session being recorded? So that's why I keep repeating it. Let's move on. Now, the name kind of gives this away. This actually came in from ProE. And this is just a section of a model, basically a quarter of it. And the reason you're only seeing a quarter of it is because this model was so corrupt that it couldn't even be modified. The history tree was so difficult and so corrupt that you couldn't even make one little tiny change without ProE just dying. Okay. And if we look at this model, it doesn't look too bad, but let's kind of zoom up into a couple key areas. For example, this blend right here, nice looking blend, but there's this little extra line kind of cutting through this little corner right here, which doesn't make sense. You don't see that up here, but that's kind of odd. Okay, and then we get some blends that kind of just terminate. In fact, I call this the bird's beak. Kind of looks like a bird to me. Like, why that? Not too bad. Okay, but as we move up here, take a look at this section. Especially this blend across the top, you see a whole bunch of extra edges that just don't make sense. Okay, there's 3 over here, 2 over here, 4 over here. And this would make me really nervous if I was asked to manufacture this. Anytime I see an edge, to me, that means it's not tangential. So maybe as we're machining this, we're going to get a whole bunch of chatter as it's going along because it's not doing a nice smooth transition. I'd be really nervous machining this. Same thing with like this rib. Why is there all these little extra faces, 2 on that side, but only 1 on this side? There's a little face up here. It's weird. Okay. And we got a nice rib, nice and centered here. This one's off by a little bit, and this one is way off. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. Maybe, again, because the history tree failed, something miscalculated or whatever, and it didn't do this pattern correctly or anything. So we obviously want to fix this to be able to work with it. Okay, so let's start with the easy stuff. I want to just get rid of this blend. And you've seen the power of Fusion. I can just click on a face and say delete. But notice what happens. It sits there and thinks and thinks and thinks. And finally it comes up and it says, the operation could not cause a meaningful shape change. And this, I think, is going to answer Julian's question about, will it give me errors if I select too many faces or not enough faces or whatever? And this is, like I said earlier, probably the most difficult part about direct editing is trying to figure out, why did this not work? Just, 5 minutes ago, I showed you how easy it is to delete faces and fix the model. But why can I not delete this blend? That's probably the most simplest thing. Well, it's probably because of this guy over here. Remember, Fusion has to heal this geometry, so it probably doesn't know, there's probably something mathematically wrong over here, and so it just doesn't know how to heal that area, okay? So here's where that wound and heal method comes in. And this is just a method I came up with that basically we want to destroy all the problem areas and let Fusion heal that wound, okay? So I've found the easiest way to do this is to actually use a sphere. And that's because a sphere is only one face. I could draw a rectangle and machine that away or cut that away, but then I've got multiple faces, whereas a sphere is only one face. However, you'll notice even in the little pop-up, it says select a plane and then specify the center point of the sphere. Okay, so we have to have a plane to draw the sphere on. And that's going to be under our construct menu. This is where you can create different planes, such as offset planes, planes at an angle, tangent, etc. But I found the easiest one is plane along a path. In fact, I'm going to add this to my toolbar. So I'm just going to put that up there because we're going to use it quite a bit. Okay. So plane along a path, I just clicked on this little 3 dots and it allows me to add something to my toolbar. So I'm going to say plane along a path, and then I'm going to select one of these paths. So I'm just going to maybe grab this guy here, and you can see that it put a plane on that path, and I can move this plane anywhere I want on that path. So I'm going to move it all the way to the very end and say okay. So it basically selected that edge, and we moved it all the way to the end. Now I can come in here and create a sphere. In fact, we're going to use this quite a bit, so I'm going to pin to my toolbar. I now have the sphere command. I'll click on this plane, and it's kind of hard to see, but the 0, 0 is actually at the end of that line that I selected, so I'm just going to get kind of near that and click. And now you can kind of see, because it's doing a cut, it actually colors it red, and it sort of looks like a wound. Okay? Now, here's what we want to do. We want to destroy all of these problematic areas. So I'm going to make this a little bit larger. And I want to make sure I go large enough. So for example, we now see I've got a really nice edge right here. Nice edge there, nice edge there. However, there's a little tiny sliver face right here. So I haven't gone far enough. So I need to make it a little bit larger, like so. Okay. Now you can see this face does not touch this face, does not touch this face or any of these other faces over here. Okay. We've basically scooped out all of that problematic area. Now, don't go crazy and just say, okay, make the sphere as big as I want, because then you might start destroying other features and stuff like that. So you just want to make sure you're going large enough that you get rid of all of these problematic areas. So I'm just going to go something like this and say, okay. And we've now scooped out that area. And again, this blend no longer touches this blend, which no longer touches any of these other blends or faces or whatever. And that's good, okay? Now, this blend touches this blend, which touches this one, etc. And maybe this is a problematic blend over here because it's kind of weird shaped or something. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to basically put a wound over here. So I'll say plane along a path. I'll click on this path right here and drag it to the end. Okay, now here's a tip for you. Okay, when you click on your path, I recommend picking the biggest line closest to the area. And what do I mean by that? If I click this line here, notice how tiny it's even hard to see how tiny my plane is. That's because it's basically a ratio of the length of that line. So if I were to click this line here, you'll see there's the plane. Again, kind of hard to see, but it's a ratio of that edge. So I try and grab as big of an edge. So when I grab this guy, you can see the plane is much bigger because, again, it's a ratio of that whole edge. Okay, just a little trick there. I'll say, okay, I'll create a sphere. I'll put it there. I'll make sure that this is big enough that I get rid of all of the problematic areas. You'll notice there's two little slivers right there, another one down there. So I want to make sure I go larger, making sure that that no longer touches that, which no longer touches that. That looks pretty good. I'll say okay. And now notice this blend. In fact, let's grab all of them. I'll just do all these guys. They no longer touch that weird blend that was over there. So now if I say delete, instantly it heals. It worked. Where before it didn't work, now it did. But then you're probably saying, well, Brad, what about those stupid holes in your part, right? Well, again, they're a single face. So I could select that face and say delete. And look what Fusion had to do. It had to heal that wound. And so it grew that face down, it grew this face over, and it kind of, healed that area. Same thing with this guy over here. I'll select it, I'll say delete, and notice what it did. In fact, this one's a little bit more weird because these are two different size blends, but it extended it to this face, it extended that down to that blend. In fact, now if I click on this edge and say fillet, and I start to drag a fillet, you'll see I get an error until it's big enough, but now we can see a nice, beautiful corner blend, okay? Where before we had that weird extra line that made no sense. So here we are, we're able to fix geometry that nobody else was able to fix, right? It was so corrupt, but we're able to fix that using that kind of that wound and heal method. And you're gonna see that as we go on with some of the other parts. Okay, so let's work on this guy. Now, here's another tip. There's a lot of problematic fillets and stuff on here, and this fillet touches this face, which touches this, which touches this, etc., etc. So believe it or not, if I try and do something up here, but there's something mathematically wrong way over here, it might actually fail because it just can't solve that problem, solve that solution. But I want to be able to work on this area. So we're going to take the wound and heal method to the next level. We're basically going to amputate this whole section off. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a sketch, maybe just on this front plane here, or this side plane. And I'm going to draw a rectangle that kind of encompasses this whole area, maybe something like this. Okay. I don't want to worry about any of the other stuff over here. I just really want to worry about this up here. So I just drew a sketch. I'll come in here and say split body. What's the body to split? This orange part. What's the splitting tool? I'll select this rectangle. You can kind of see it gives me kind of a preview of what that's going to do. But watch what happens under my bodies right here. I'm going to say okay, and I now have two separate bodies. In fact, I could turn off the one I don't need, and now I'm only working on this little section right here. In fact, you can even see graphically, it looks like there's something going on with how that circle is being calculated. There's, like I said, there's a lot wrong with this part, okay? But now this blend is touching this face, which is touching this face, which is touching this face, and then it stops right there. Nothing else affects this anymore. So I have a much better chance of this working now. And hopefully that makes sense. So let's start with, let's just take a look at the top. So this rib looks good, but this rib doesn't. So I'm just going to draw a box around that rib. So you'll notice I was kind of careful. I didn't just go like this, right? Because then I selected way too much stuff. I'm just going to draw a box that kind of encompasses that rib. And if I rotate, we can see that it grabbed all of those faces in one selection. So again, instead of coming in here and grabbing, having to zoom up and click these little faces and then zoom out and rotate, zoom in, et cetera, use the selection sets to your benefit. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a box and say delete. And it instantly removed that rib. I'll do the same thing over here. And again, I'm going to be kind of careful. Maybe zoom up a little bit more. Draw a box like so. Again, I want to make sure I'm only grabbing the faces that I want. And this time it looks like it did a good job. But to answer, I think Simon asked the question about what if you have too many faces or whatever. So let me just do something like this. So you can see that it accidentally grabbed too many faces. I can come in and hold down my shift key and unselect those faces. Now, why would I want to unselect these two faces here? Well, because I'm only dealing with this rib right here. If I were to try and delete this, Fusion's going to have to solve these blends, and I don't want to worry about these blends right now. I only want to worry about the ribs. So I'm going to unselect those guys out of there. So hopefully that answers your question, Simon. I'll hit delete, and we now have gotten rid of those two weird ribs. We're left with this rib here, but it also has like two edges on one edge on the other, extra little faces and stuff like that. So I want to get rid of this blend that goes all the way around. Okay. Again, that's a lot of faces and zooming to select. But if I draw a box around it like this, it selects the rib, which I want to keep. So here's again where the shift key comes in. I'm going to draw a box around everything to select what I want, and I'm going to shift unselect the three faces that have to do with the rib. And that was pretty easy. Not a lot of zooming or rotating and stuff like that. We'll say delete. And I've just deleted that fillet or blend that goes around that rib. Okay. Here's another example why these three little patches down here, those should be nice and smooth, but they're not. So, okay. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them out into the Q&A. Hopefully this is making sense and you're learning some tips and seeing what you can do with imported geometry. So let's go ahead and remove this blend or this fillet that goes all the way around. And like we've learned, probably the best way of doing that is to use a selection set or selection window, I should say. So I'm just going to draw a window kind of from the side that kind of encompasses all of those blends. However, if I rotate, we'll see it also selected that top face. And you might say, well, does that matter? Well, again, think about what would happen if we said delete right now. Fusion is going to have to grow these faces. And how far? Well, infinitely. So it's probably going to fail. So we want to unselect that one top face. And now we're left with just the fillet chain that goes all the way around. Okay, we've done this multiple times. We'll hit delete and magically it'll go away, right? Or not. Okay, so here's one of those situations. The operation failed. Try adjusting the value. And you're like, well, why did that fail? You've been deleting complex blends and all that kind of stuff, and it's worked. So why did this one not work? Okay, and the answer is that's a good question. I think it's probably because these fillets or blends touch this face, and this face touches this guy, which seems kind of weird. And it probably doesn't know how to solve that. Maybe these aren't tangential with each other or something like that. So how would I go about getting rid of this? Well, in this case, it's actually better to get rid of as many of the fillets at the same time, because we know that these fillets are touching these fillets, which are touching these fillets, which then end on a flat face, which should be okay. It's probably something that has to do with any of these kind of fillets here. So we're going to remove all of those at the same time. So let's go ahead and say delete. We'll do the exact same thing. I'm just going to draw a box around the top part there. Notice it found 43 faces. I'll go ahead and unselect that top face. Now we're down to 42. Then I'm going to kind of look at it from the top. Okay. And I'm just going to draw small selection windows that kind of encompass these vertical fillet areas. So you can kind of see how I'm just drawing small boxes. I don't want to go crazy and draw something like that, because then it's going to select more faces than what we want. So I'm just going to make sure I'm grabbing just these little areas like so. Okay. Now if I rotate around, you'll see that it actually selected, now we have 66, it selected all of those faces. And I probably should go ahead and select those big fillets on the bottom. So holding down my shift key, I'm just going to draw a box around something like that. And I've now selected all of those fillets or blends, 73 of them in basically 3 mouse clicks. Well, more than that, I'm sorry, in a few mouse clicks. Watch what happens when I say okay. Instantly, it solves. It worked. It was able to figure out and calculate how to mathematically make this correct. In fact, you'll notice it's not a surface model or anything like that. It's a solid body. Okay. So we've pretty much brought this down to its simplest form. Now I can come back and start recreating. So for example, I'm going to select that edge and say fillet. Now, I always forget to do this. I typically make a copy of the original model, and then I can reference that. So I can, I'll maybe have it over to the side and I'll say, what size is this fillet? Oh, it's 3 or whatever. But I've done this demo so many times, I kind of already know that these are radius of 3. So I'm just going to go around and pick this radius or these edges to create a nice radius of 3 all the way around. Okay. Then maybe I'll click on this guy and do a fillet, radius of 1, and look how beautiful that blend looks. No extra lines, no extra faces or anything like that. Okay. Same thing maybe down here. We'll make that a radius of 3. And look at how nice, I don't want it to be a variable radius. It to be a constant radius. I don't know why it was variable. But you can see how nice the corners are. Okay. We don't have those extra little patches going on. And then finally, let's do maybe this edge here. We want that to be a radius of 1. And notice how nice it looks. No extra faces or edges. It makes sense. So very quickly, we've kind of rebuilt it. The last thing we need to do is put this rib back where it belongs. So let's go ahead and say pattern, circular pattern. I'm just going to draw a box around that rib. What's my axis? Well, we'll select maybe like this edge or this face, doesn't really matter. You can see quantity of 3 by default. I'll say okay, and boom. We now have the 3 ribs, and they're in line and center and all that kind of stuff. It kind of makes sense now. So we've fixed this area. I would now not be nervous machining this. I wouldn't get the chatter marks or anything like that. Let's turn on this other body and come in here and say combine. What's the target? What's the tool? We want to join those together. I'll say okay, and we are back to one solid body. So we were able to fix that issue, or all of those issues, I should say. So hopefully that made sense. We used the wound and heal method to kind of destroy some problematic areas using those spheres, okay? And we kind of took it to the next level. We basically removed a whole section of the part and worked on it kind of individually, and then we reattached it back to the original body, okay? Okay, let's keep moving on since I'm not getting a whole bunch of questions. Hopefully this is making sense. Here's another prime example. This is an imported part. This is a truck grill off of a particular truck. And maybe we've determined that it makes more sense for this little mounting flange, this mounting tab, to be in line with some of these support ribs or whatever, just for strength reasons, to keep it from flexing as much and stuff like that. So we just want to move these few little tiny faces. I mean, there's just like what, 6 or 7 faces there. We're going to move that to the left. So this is a pretty simple example. So I'm going to say move faces. We'll draw a box. Now I'll just do a free move in this case, and let's just drag it to the left. And notice that we instantly get an error message. Move face fails due to an unexpected result. Again, the reason I'm showing this is because as you start messing with parts and stuff like that, you're going to get some of these issues also, and you're going to go, well, why did it work for Brad, but it didn't work for me? Well, that's why I'm showing you it's not working for me, okay? And I'll show you how to fix this. So unfortunately, this is not a simple change or a simple move. Like I figured I could just drag that to the left, but it's not letting me. Well, why? Okay. Unfortunately, it's because this is a poorly designed model. Okay. There's lots of mistakes on it. And as I started to investigate, here's a prime example. As I zoom up here, notice this little tiny sliver face right here. It is small. In fact, it's so small that it almost like breaks up. You can kind of see how it gets all pixelated as I kind of rotate around and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Why is there this tiny little sliver there? Who knows? Okay. So I selected it. I'll hit delete, and Fusion healed that. We got rid of that problem sliver face. Okay. Why is there an edge right here? Again, who knows? To me, that means these faces aren't planar with each other. There's no need for an edge to be there if they're not planar. So I'm going to go ahead and select that face and hit delete. And now you can see that sure enough, it healed that geometry and that edge is no longer a problem. So we're starting to fix this, okay? Same thing over here. There's a couple extra edges. So I'm just going to delete a couple of these faces real quick just to kind of heal this geometry. So that looks better. We're getting over to here. Okay, let's just say that's good. I kind of fixed all those problem areas. Let's try the move again. So I'll say move, faces. We'll do a free move again and drag to the left. And unfortunately, same error. Okay, even though I kind of fixed what I thought was the problem, we're still getting the error. And it could be something because of this face. It could be maybe because this circular face is touching this other face over here. Who knows? There's something wrong with this model mathematically that Fusion can't calculate and figure out how to heal this geometry back together. So we're going to do the exact same thing we did with that orange part. We're basically going to cut a section away. So let's just create a sketch, maybe on this tab. I'm just going to draw a rectangle that kind of encompasses this area here. It doesn't matter what size or anything like that. I just want to make sure I'm getting a little bit of this rib, and I'm also getting where this tab is. So we'll say stop our sketch. we'll do the exact same thing. We'll say split. I'll click on that guy. What's my splitting tool? That guy there. Watch our bodies. And when I say okay, we now have two separate bodies. I'll turn off the one that I don't need. And now we're looking at just this little tiny section. Let's try move. I'll draw a box around it. Free move, and notice I can move it now. Why? Because it's not having to calculate something over here that's causing the problem. Okay. The other thing I like, kind of looking at it from the side, notice how it actually keeps the tab at the same level, but it's actually changing the length of the arm or whatever you want to call that, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so Julian asked earlier, can you move parts to an exact location using points? And the answer is yes. In fact, in this case here, I'm going to say, let's move these faces. I could do a free move, but I want these to be perfectly lined up. And I have no idea what number I should type in. I could guess, but as an engineer, I don't want to guess, right? So we're going to do point to point. However, I don't have 2 points that I could go to. You can kind of see it's, I could go, it doesn't find the center of the circle, unfortunately. It finds the center of the face, but I could go from that point there to that point there. That wouldn't work. So I can't use point to point in this case. So here's another little trick. We're going to use a sketch and project the information onto a plane. So I'm going to click on that face and say create sketch. We'll do the project command, P for project. I'm just going to go ahead and project that face there. And let's project this rib here. I'll say okay. And we basically just projected that geometry onto our sketch. And even though you can kind of see this rib is floating up here in space, it projected that information onto this plane for us. Okay, pretty useful. So now I'm going to just create some geometry. So you'll see it's actually going to catch to the center. I'll just come up a little bit, making sure I'm vertical. So you can see 90 degrees there. Okay. Then I'm going to come over here. Let me zoom up just a little bit. You can see it's snapping to the center there. So I'm going to just drag straight up. That's what we call a snap guide. Okay. It's basically snapped to the center of this rib right here. I just bring it up, and we're now exactly 90 degrees and centered. So I'm just going to go ahead and click right there. And that's okay. That's all I need. I don't need to come back down or anything like that. What I need is this distance from here to here. Okay? Because this is the center of our big tab, and this is the center of our rib. Okay? If I turn off the body, we can see we just created a kind of a sketch that went from the center of the tab to the center of the rib. Now, when I come in here and say move faces, I'll just draw a box around those faces. And I'm going to say point to point. And these points now are on the same plane. So I'm going to say go from here to here. And you can see how it moved those faces across that exact distance. I'll say okay. We can turn off our sketches. And now our tab is perfectly lined up with that rib. We'll turn our other body back on. I'll come in here and combine these back together. Join them together, say okay. And we can see that the rib or the tab is in line with that rib. So again, we were able to work with existing geometry that has no history, no sketches, no features or anything, but we were able to make the change. And I think this is really important. You don't know how many times I've been at customers where they're like, yeah, the part we got from the vendor was so corrupt that we just remodeled it. A prime example, it was at a suitcase company. They designed the hard case suitcases, and there's a lot of structural ribs inside these suitcases. And they got one from a vendor, and they just needed to move the rib over a couple millimeters, and they ended up remodeling the whole thing because they could not move that one little rib. They didn't know you could use direct modeling. This is before the Fusion. This is my previous life. So to me, it's just amazing what you can do with direct modeling and direct editing. Here's one more example. Went out to GrabCAD, brought in a Raspberry Pi circuit board, found a Raspberry Pi case, a mounting case or something like that, because I want to 3D print this guy to mount this for my Octoprint on my 3D printer, for example. So let's go ahead and assemble this. So I'm going to just create a quick joint. Let's do maybe, I'll just say that is going to register with this guy here. Move that in place. We'll say OK. And I now have it positioned. But I'm going to kind of investigate this a little bit. And as I'm looking at this, I notice for whatever reason, just kind of look at it straight from the side, the flash drive or whatever, the SD card, is kind of to the left of this opening here. It's almost like the opening is not in the right spot. So that might make it kind of hard to pull the SD card out. So maybe I want to fix that before I 3D print this thing. Okay. Continuing looking at this, let's kind of look at it from the side here. I also notice, for whatever reason, the opening for this port right here seems to be a little bit off center, not by much, but just by a little bit. So I might want to move that over. And then the important part are the mounting holes. So I'm going to section through. And if you don't do a lot of sectioning, I highly recommend it, because you'll see how powerful this is. I'm going to say section analysis. I'm just going to click on a planar face. What this allows us to do is basically slice through our model. So I'm going to slice to these mounting holes. And I'm going to take a look. Oops. And that looks pretty good. But as I'm looking over here, that one looks like it's off by a little bit. Okay. So that might work. I could probably force a screw into there or something like that, but it'd be better to fix this. And so I'm even going to use direct modeling techniques in like 2.5D, basically. Okay. So I'm going to select this face and that face at the same time. Okay. I'll say move. Notice I didn't select the chamfer. I don't think I have to. But I'm going to say move. And again, I'm going to go from point to point. And as I hover over, oops, too close. As I hover over this edge, you'll see there's a little plus symbol right there. So I'm going to click, that's my start point. I'm going to hover over that edge, and it's kind of hard to see because it's blue, but there's the other plus. So I'm going to click on that guy, and notice it moved over. And so did the chamfer. Okay, actually, it doesn't look like a chamfer did. Maybe. So I should probably have moved that also. So let me add my selection. So that must not be a real chamfer. So I just added that face. Hopefully you saw that. Notice when I hold down my control, that's the previous position. And there's the new position. So you can kind of see how we're basically selecting those faces almost in like 2.5D, right? In this section view. And we're moving both of those over at the same time. Okay. Now, with that said, I'm going to make sure I do this guy also. So I'm going to select those faces, and you can see how it's going to move over at the same time. So there's where it was, that's where it's going. So I'm moving both of those at the same time. I'll say OK. We'll turn our Raspberry Pi back on. And let's go ahead and edit the section analysis and let's slice all the way through maybe to those mounting holes. And I can verify that that lined up, that fixed the problem. And those are lined up. So I now know that my 3D printed part is going to be correct. Okay. Let's fix this little hole area right here. So I want to move these guys over. So I'm going to select that face there and that face there. And I'm going to do this a couple different ways. I'm only going to select these two faces. I'll say move. And we'll do the point to point again. And believe it or not, I can actually like hover over, for example, this edge, and there's the center of that circular edge. So I'm going to grab that guy. Then I'm going to hover over, something round on this guy, and you can kind of see how there is the center for that guy. And you can see how it just shifted those faces over. Okay, that's where it was. That's where it's going. Notice this face right here that I'm kind of hovering over right now. Notice that it's not changing size or depth or anything like that. Okay, and the reason for that is I didn't select it. So Fusion is moving these two blue faces and it's having to grow left or right in the same plane to make that match. However, if I had added those three faces, notice now what happens. Previous and new. Okay, now this might seem kind of confusing, but why is that changing? And the reason for that is because I said move all of these faces from basically this plane here, the center of this plane, to the center of this plane. You can see that it's offset by a little bit. So it's actually moving that face. So again, kind of I'm picking on Julian here. He asked a really good question about, moving, which faces do you select? It does matter, okay? I would select as few as you need to make the thing work. Hopefully that makes sense, okay? So I'll say okay, and I've just fixed that issue. And then let's work on this guy here. So I'll say move. Hello, sorry. Faces. Now, I could select them manually, but I'm going to turn off the Raspberry Pi, and now I should be able to draw a box, grab all those faces, and then turn the Raspberry Pi back on. Okay. And in this case, I'm going to do a free move. I really don't care if it's perfectly centered. I want it to be pretty centered. So we can see it's about 0.39. So I'm going to say move it over 0.4 to be precise. Okay. I could have created a sketch, found the center of my big slot here, found the center of the SD card, and moved it point by point. I absolutely could have done that. But you can kind of see here, you can just dynamically drag until you get it to looking where you want it to be. So I might look it straight on and just do something like that. So it actually looks like about 0.5, makes the most sense. And I'll say, okay, and we've now fixed that problem. Okay. Everything works. I can now come in here and save as STL and send it to my 3D printer. And I know that my Raspberry Pi is now going to sit right on top of that. The screw holes are going to be lined up and everything is going to be good. Okay. So, okay. Any questions there? I'm going to pause. We got about 10 minutes left. I think I'm going to stop here. I usually show one more method, but I think there's enough information here. Hopefully you found this beneficial. I'll stay on for a few more minutes if you have any questions. I'll throw them out into the Q&A. Otherwise, I want to thank you for your attendance and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you. So, asked a question about lectures on thermo simulation. No, I'm not an FEA specialist, so I would not be the right person to do that. But I do know that we can do, um, like thermal simulations, and in fact, what are all the options? I apologize. Um, I don't want to say that. Just a second. Thermal and thermal stress. Sorry, I couldn't remember thermal stress, but there are some videos out there. I do have some people on my team that are stronger in the simulation type stuff. I would also recommend out on our webpage. There's one on simulation in here. I'm not 100% sure if it has thermal in there, but you might watch that video. Ryan, thank you for the feedback. I appreciate that. Simon, thank you. Oh yeah, with that said, I should actually show this. I've been starting to do live streams every Tuesday and Thursday. So if you just do a search for Brad Tallis out on YouTube, you should find these. I've done quite a few of them. Showing how to create feed guides, working with imported geometry, bodies and components, mesh data, assemblies and joints, etc. And I'm doing a drawings one here in about an hour or a couple hours at 3 o'clock Mountain. So I've been trying to do these live streams, and there's a lot of information out there. So definitely recommend, if you want, watch those, subscribe, hit the little bell icon, and you'll get notified when these are happening. So definitely recommend those. Okay. Cool, Julian. Thank you for the feedback. Don't see any other questions, so I'm going to let everybody go. Again, have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you on a future live stream or webinar.